They laughed when they saw the black single dad kneeling beside an old pickup truck, his hands covered in grease, as he changed a flat tire for a crying stranger on a lonely roadside. Some drivers mocked him. Others recorded him, convinced he was just another poor mechanic wasting his afternoon. The woman thanked him through tears and quietly drove away. He never asked her name or expected anything in return. But the very next morning, a convoy of luxury SUVs stopped outside his tiny garage. A billionaire mother stepped out and called his name as if she'd been searching for him for years. Marcus Jackson had a way of disappearing into the background of things. He was the kind of man people looked past, not because he was invisible, but because he had spent so long making himself small that the world had simply agreed with the gesture. He was 40 years old that autumn, and most of the visible evidence of his life could have fit inside a single oil-stained toolbox. A modest garage on the east side of Clover Hill, a truck that had logged enough miles to retire 3 times over, and a pair of boots so worn down at the heel that they listed slightly to the left when he stood still. He had a daughter named Maya, who was 14 and studying at a boarding school 3 states away on a partial scholarship he had scraped and bargained and quietly wept for on the phone with the admissions office 2 years running. She was the arithmetic behind every decision he made. She was the reason he woke up at 5 in the morning, the reason he ate calm standing over the engine he was fixing, the reason he did not allow him. Marcus knew, with the uncomplicated certainty of a man who had already survived the worst thing that could happen to him, that bitterness was a luxury he could not afford. The garage was called Jackson's Auto, a name that had never appeared in any advertisement, had never been painted in anything larger than the modest hand-lettered sign above the bay door, and had survived entirely on word of mouth and the stubborn loyalty of a small circle of regulars who had been coming to Marcus for years. His rates were fair. His work was honest. He did not cut corners, and he did not upsell people on parts they did not need, which made him both morally respectable and financially unremarkable. The waiting area was a single plastic chair beside a vending machine that accepted only exact change. The coffee was instant. The walls were bare, except for a calendar from an auto parts supplier and a photograph of Maya at age 9, grinning in front of a sandcastle they had built at the beach the summer before everything changed. Marcus had never taken the photograph down, and he never would. Customers who waited long enough sometimes asked about the girl in the picture, and Marcus would say, simply, "My daughter," and go back to work. He offered nothing more, because there was nothing more he wanted to share. He had learned, in the years since his wife passed, that grief shared with strangers had a way of becoming entertainment, and he refused to let anyone be entertained by the most important losses of his life. People who didn't know him, which was most of the town, really tended to make their assessments quickly. They saw the truck, they saw the coveralls, they saw the dark skin and the quiet disposition and the modest address, and they assembled a portrait that had very little to do with the actual man. Customers haggled over labor costs in ways they would never have dared with other mechanics across town. Delivery drivers spoke to him with a casual impatience that bordered on dismissal. Once, a man in a suit had pulled up, looked at the garage, looked at Marcus, and then driven away without getting out of the car, presumably deciding that a man who looked like Marcus could not possibly be trusted with a European import. Marcus had watched the car pull back onto the road and return to the engine he was rebuilding, and said nothing. He had said nothing because there was nothing useful to say, and because his hands were already deep in the work, and because he had long ago decided that the opinions of strangers were not load-bearing structures in his life. But the truth was that he noticed. He always noticed. He had simply gotten very good at not letting the noticing reach his face. "People only notice your hands when they're dirty," he told Maya once, during one of their Wednesday evening phone calls, and she had laughed the way only a teenager can, with that precise mixture of amusement and discomfort that means the joke landed exactly where it was supposed to. He had not explained what he meant. He trusted that she would understand in time, the way children of quiet fathers eventually decode the language their parents speak in silences and small gestures. The afternoon it happened was a Thursday in late October, the kind of day that can't decide whether it wants to be beautiful or miserable and settles on both at once. The sky had been overcast since noon, and by 3 o'clock, a slow, persistent rain had begun to fall. Not the dramatic kind that clears itself out quickly, but the gray, settled kind that seems to have made up its mind to stay. Marcus was running an errand to the parts supplier on the far side of town. The old pickup, loaded with a replaced alternator he needed to return, and a short list of components he'd been waiting 2 weeks to source. He was not in a hurry. He was almost never in a hurry. The truck moved through the wet streets at its own considered pace, windshield wipers marking slow, deliberate time against the rain, the radio playing something quiet and forgettable that Marcus wasn't really listening to. He was thinking about Maya. She had a history presentation the following week, and she had called him the night before to practice her opening lines. And he had listened with the focused attention of a man attending a concert, offering small corrections and generous encouragement in equal measure. He was still turning over the memory of her voice, confident, precise, slightly too fast when she got excited, when he rounded the long curve on Route 16 and saw the car. It was a dark green SUV, newer model, with that kind of quiet luxury that announces itself in the absence of any unnecessary detail. It sat on the shoulder of the road at a slight angle. The rear passenger tire collapsed and ruined against the wet asphalt. The hazard lights were going. Standing beside the vehicle, her back against the door and her arms wrapped around herself against the cold, was a woman in a charcoal wool coat who looked like she had been crying recently and was working very hard not to cry again. She was perhaps 38. Maybe a year or two older or younger than that. It was difficult to tell through the rain. What was clear was that she was alone, that she was cold, and that in the 20 or so minutes she had apparently been standing there, not a single other vehicle had slowed down to offer assistance. Marcus watched 3 cars pass her without braking as he approached. He pulled his truck onto the shoulder. He did not think about it. There was no calculation involved, no weighing of options or assessment of risk or consideration of what it might look like. A black man, in work clothes, pulling over beside a well-dressed white woman on a deserted stretch of road in the rain. Later, when people would ask him why he stopped, he would look genuinely puzzled by the question, the way a person looks when asked to explain something they have never considered needing an explanation. He stopped because someone needed help. The sequence was that simple. He put the truck in park, pulled his old rain jacket from behind the seat, and got out. The rain was cold and immediate. He walked toward the woman with his hands visible at his sides, not because he was afraid of her, but because he was not afraid of her, and he wanted her to understand that from the beginning. She looked up when she heard his boots on the wet gravel. There was a moment brief, honest, and mutual, where they read each other across the space between them, the way strangers do when circumstances have removed the usual buffer of social distance. Then Marcus tilted his head toward the flat tire and said, "I can take care of that, if you'll let me." The woman's shoulders released a tension they had been holding for some time. She nodded. Marcus went back to the truck for his tools. He worked without ceremony. He cleared the area behind the tire, broke the lug nuts loose before jacking the vehicle, positioned the jack at the correct reinforced point along the frame, the kind of precision that looks like habit, but is actually knowledge, the kind of knowledge that comes from years of doing something correctly and repeatedly until it becomes automatic. The woman stood a few feet away, watching him, with an expression that moved between gratitude and something more complicated, something that looked like being unexpectedly moved. Once, she reached into her coat and produced her wallet, and Marcus looked at her hands without stopping his work and said, simply, "No, thank you." She hesitated. He continued. She put the wallet away. The rain kept falling. He finished the job in 12 minutes, not because he was rushing, but because he knew what he was doing. When he stood up, his knees were wet through, and his jacket was soaked along the shoulders. He showed her where the spare was seated, mentioned that it was a temporary tire and she should get a proper replacement within a day or two at most, and then began collecting his tools. The woman tried twice more to offer payment. Each time, Marcus declined with the kind of uncomplicated courtesy that leaves no room for debate. On her third attempt, she simply held out a bottle of water she had retrieved from the car. And something in the directness of the gesture, the honesty of it, the way she had abandoned argument and simply offered what she had made Marcus accept it. He drank half in one long pull and set the rest on the bed of his truck. Then he looked at her to confirm she was all right. She was not all right, not entirely, but she was better, and her eyes said so in a way that her composed expression was trying to contain. "I'll never forget today," she said. Her voice was steady, but only just. Marcus nodded once, the way men who don't require acknowledgement nod not dismissively, but with a kind of comfortable finality. He got back into his truck and drove away. And by the time he reached the parts supplier, he had more or less stopped thinking about the incident entirely. What Marcus could not have known, and what nobody on Route 16 that afternoon would have guessed, was that the story had not ended when he drove away. In fact, in a sense, the story had not yet begun. Somebody had recorded a piece of it, not the whole thing, not the patience or the professionalism or the quiet refusals, but a short clip from a passing car's dash cam, poorly lit and shot from an unflattering angle, showing Marcus on his knees in the rain beside a luxury vehicle he clearly did not own, his coveralls marked with the day's accumulated evidence of honest work. The person who posted it offered a caption that they likely considered witty, suggesting that a poor black mechanic was performing free labor for a rich woman, probably hoping she would notice him. The post spread in the casual, thoughtless way that certain kinds of content spread not because anyone particularly cared, but because it scratched a particular itch of comfortable condescension that requires very little engagement to enjoy. By the next morning, it had accumulated a significant amount of commentary, most of it in a register somewhere between amusement and mild contempt. At the cafe on Elm, where Marcus bought his coffee every Friday, a table of men had seen it. They laughed about it with the easy authority of people who have never had to change a tire in the rain for a stranger. One of them said Marcus was foolish. Another suggested, with the tired creativity of a man who considers himself perceptive, that Marcus would spend his whole life poor because he gave too much away for free. A third agreed, in a way that made clear he had not fully understood the first point, but did not want to be left out. None of them had ever been helped by Marcus. None of them knew him. None of them knew anything about the woman, or about what she had needed in that moment, or about what it costs a person to be steady and generous on an afternoon when they are cold and tired, and the world has just handed them a reminder of how quickly things can go sideways. Marcus, for his part, had not seen the post. He did not spend much time on the sort of platforms where such things circulated. When a neighbor mentioned it to him that Friday morning, with the slightly uncomfortable expression of someone delivering news they're not sure how to frame, Marcus listened, thanked her, finished his coffee, and went to open the garage. He was not performing equanimity. He genuinely did not have much patience for the architecture of other people's opinions about him. What they thought he was did not change what he actually was, and what he actually was had nothing to do with their commentary. He had an oil change at 8 and a brake job at 10, and he needed to call Maya at 7:30 before she went to class, and those were the things that required his attention. Evelyn Carter had spent the better part of Thursday night sitting in a hospital chair beside her mother's bed, listening to the particular silence of a medical facility at 2 in the morning, which is a silence composed of distant machines and faraway voices, and the low hum of a building trying very hard to sustain human life. Her mother was recovering from a procedure, nothing immediately catastrophic, but significant enough and unexpected enough that Evelyn had cleared an entire day from a schedule that had never voluntarily given up a single hour in the last decade. She had driven to the hospital herself, without security, without her assistant, without the small professional apparatus that typically traveled with her. She had needed the space. She was the chief executive of a company that employed thousands of people across 9 countries, and she had been running it for 11 years, with a discipline and a clarity of focus that people who worked for her described, depending on their relationship with her, as either inspiring or terrifying. She was also a single mother to a 12-year-old boy named Noah, who was at home with the nanny and had called her 3 times since 9 in the evening and would call again at 6 in the morning, reliable as a clock. She ran a company, and she raised a child, and she managed her mother's health concerns, and she did all of this in the compressed, unrelenting way of a person who has never found a credible reason to stop. She was brilliant. She was private. She was, in the way of people who have been powerful long enough, accustomed to a particular dynamic in which her needs were anticipated, and her presence generated a kind of responsive energy in the people around her. People did things for Evelyn Carter because of who she was. This was not vanity, it was simply the operational reality of being Evelyn Carter. And she had long since made her peace with it, while privately finding it, on certain quiet evenings, exhausting. The tire had blown on the curve of Route 16 at approximately 2:45 in the afternoon. She had felt the rear of the vehicle pull and known immediately what had happened. She had grown up in a household where her father had insisted all three of his daughters know how to change a tire, a fact that her younger sisters recalled with resentment and Evelyn recalled with gratitude. But the spare was beneath the vehicle's cargo floor, under luggage she had packed that morning in the organized rush of an emergency departure, and she had not been able to locate the jack handle in the unfamiliar car, a rental, because her own vehicle was in for service. And by the time she had established these facts, the rain had committed to its intention, and she was standing on the shoulder of a state route with wet hair and a dying phone, and the specific helplessness of a person who is accustomed to solving problems through organization and has encountered a problem that does not respond to that approach. She had called for roadside assistance. They estimated 45 minutes. She had stood there while car after car passed, and she had understood, with a clarity that the warmth and safety of her usual life tended to obscure what it meant to be alone and in need of help and invisible to everyone who could provide it. She was thinking about that, about the specific texture of being unseen when she heard boots on wet gravel and looked up and saw a man in a rain jacket walking toward her with his hands visible at his sides. He did not ask her name. He did not ask whether she needed assistance. He could see that she needed assistance. The question would have been performative. He simply asked if she would let him help, and then he helped, and in 12 minutes the problem was solved, and he was packing his tools away with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this specific thing many times, which he had. He declined money 3 times with a consistency that communicated the refusals were not negotiations. He answered her questions about the spare tire with the patience and specificity of a teacher who respects his student. When she finally gave him the water, the last thing she had to offer, he accepted it without commentary, and she understood, in the moment, that this was a different kind of transaction from the ones she had grown accustomed to in her professional life. A transaction that had nothing to do with value extraction or reciprocity or positioning, but was simply one person receiving what another person offered, cleanly and without debt. When he drove away, she stood for a moment in the rain before getting back into the car, and she felt something she had not felt in a long time. Not gratitude exactly, though that was part of it, but a kind of recalibration. A reminder that the world contained people who behaved well, not because they expected to benefit from it, but because they had decided to be that kind of person, and had not revisited the decision. In the car, on the way to the hospital, she reached into the pocket of her coat and found the cloth. Marcus had handed her a clean shop rag, folded precisely when she had tried to help him, and he had declined, but offered her something to dry her hands with. Some obscure and instinctive extension of hospitality that she hadn't quite processed in the moment. She had put it in her pocket automatically. She held it in her lap for the rest of the drive. By the time she reached the hospital, she had made a decision. She did not make impulsive decisions. She made decisions based on evidence and pattern recognition, and what she had observed in those 12 minutes on Route 16 constituted both. In the waiting room, while her mother rested, and the night settled into its particular quiet, Evelyn sent a 3-word message to her chief of staff. Find this man. She attached the screenshot she had taken of his truck's rear license plate while she was waiting for him to finish packing his tools. She had taken the photograph automatically, without thinking too much about why. Now she knew why. By the following morning, Evelyn's team had located Marcus Jackson with the systematic thoroughness of people who are paid to solve problems quickly and completely. It had not been a simple process. Marcus was not a person who left a large digital footprint, and the plate had taken some working through DMV records and a cross-reference against business registration documents before they arrived at a name and then at a garage on the east side of Clover Hill And then at a residential address 3 blocks from the garage, where the property records listed a single occupant. They had also, in the course of this research, turned up the dashcam clip that was circulating online, which Evelyn watched twice in full, without expression, before setting her tablet down. She had seen enough to understand the shape of things. She told her team they were going to visit the garage in person, and she was going with them. The convoy arrived at Jackson's Auto at 8:47 on a Friday morning. It consisted of 4 vehicles, all dark, all new, all with the particular kind of presence that comes not from ostentation but from simple, complete adequacy, the automotive equivalent of a suit that fits perfectly. They filled the narrow street in front of the garage with a quiet efficiency that was nonetheless impossible to ignore. The neighborhood noticed. A woman walking a dog on the opposite sidewalk stopped. The owner of the dry cleaning shop 2 doors down appeared in his doorway. A group of teenagers who had been sitting on the front steps of the building across the street went very still. Marcus was under a vehicle when he heard the cars pull up. He slid out from beneath the chassis, saw the convoy, and stood up slowly. His expression moved through several things: confusion, wariness, a careful and practiced neutrality, and then settled into simple attention. He waited. Evelyn Carter stepped out of the second vehicle. She was wearing a dark coat, efficient and elegant, and she moved with the unhurried confidence of a person who has not been in a hurry for a long time, because being in a hurry implies someone else is setting the pace. Her security personnel, 3 of them, positioned themselves with the practiced invisibility of professionals who know their job is to not be noticed unless they are needed. She walked toward Marcus across the oil-spotted concrete of his parking area, and the neighborhood watched, and the morning held its breath. Marcus stood his ground, not out of defiance, but out of the simple self-possession of a man who does not run toward people or away from them. Evelyn extended her hand when she was close enough, and Marcus, after a beat, took it. Her grip was firm and direct. "I finally found you," she said. Her voice was the voice of a woman who was accustomed to saying exactly what she meant, and what she meant was in the words and nothing else. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. Then something shifted in his face, the faintest beginning of recognition, though he could not yet place where he had seen her. "Ma'am," he said, with the careful courtesy of a man who has not yet determined the nature of a situation. "You've got me at a disadvantage." Evelyn almost smiled. "I know," she said. "That's the first time in a while someone's been able to say that to me." She told him who she was then, and Marcus listened without any of the performance that such a revelation typically produced in people, no sudden recalibration of posture, no adjustment of expression to one more appropriate for an encounter with wealth and consequence. He simply listened, and then he nodded and said, "The tire." She said yes. He said, "You didn't need to come all the way out here." She said, "I know. I wanted to." The neighborhood continued to watch. Several people had their phones out. None of them fully understood what they were seeing, and the not understanding would last only a few hours before the story began to reassemble itself in the public imagination. Evelyn did not conduct her business on a parking lot. She asked Marcus if they could speak somewhere private, and Marcus, who had never in his life turned away a person who asked him something directly, showed her into the small interior office behind the garage's main bay, the room with the plastic chair and the vending machine, and the photograph of Maya at age 9. Evelyn's security took positions at the door without being asked. She sat in the one available chair, and Marcus leaned against the workbench, and they talked for the better part of an hour. She began by thanking him, properly and specifically, not the reflexive expression of social obligation, but a genuine accounting of what he had done and what it had meant. She told him about her mother, about why she had been on that road, about the 45 minutes of standing in the rain before he pulled over. She told him that in her experience, people who stopped to help strangers usually wanted something from the situation: credit, connection, a story to tell, and that he had wanted none of those things, and that this was not a small observation. Marcus listened without interrupting. When she was finished, he said, "You were cold and your tire was flat. That's really all there was to it." Evelyn regarded him for a moment. "That's exactly it," she said. "That's precisely what I mean." She paused, then added, more quietly, I've been in rooms with some of the most capable people in the world. I've never had anybody help me for exactly that reason, and no other." Marcus said nothing to this. He did not say anything because there was nothing he needed to say. He understood what she was telling him, and he let it settle between them without filling the space with noise. Outside, in the street, people were still watching. Someone had already posted a photograph of the convoy. In the days that followed, pieces of the story emerged in the way stories emerge, in small communities where very little goes unobserved, not through any deliberate disclosure, but through the gradual accumulation of witnessed fragments that eventually compose a picture. People who had seen the convoy began comparing accounts. The old dashcam clip, which had been circulating in its original context, began to recirculate alongside new commentary that provided more of what had actually happened. Someone in Evelyn Carter's orbit confirmed, without giving details, that yes, she had been the woman in the clip, and yes, the man who had helped her had not known who she was, and yes, she had gone to find him the following morning. The shape of the story changed as more people understood it. The laughter that had greeted the original clip, the comfortable, casual mockery of a man being dismissed as naive, began to look different in retrospect. The way certain expressions look different once you understand their true context. Some of the people who had laughed said nothing. Some quietly deleted their comments. A few, to their credit, offered something adjacent to an apology, though it tended to arrive in the passive construction favored by people who have not fully committed to accountability. The men at the cafe on Elm Street were, on the whole, quieter than usual that Friday. What none of them knew what the story, as they understood it, did not yet contain, was the part of Marcus Jackson that he had never told anyone in Clover Hill, because no one had ever asked in a way that made him want to answer. He had not always been a small-town mechanic with a modest garage and a life that fit inside a single toolbox. Before Clover Hill, before the garage, before the years of quiet and containment, Marcus had held a degree in mechanical engineering from a university with a name that commanded immediate respect in professional circles. He had not gotten there easily. He had been the first in his family to attend a 4-year institution, had worked 2 jobs through his undergraduate years, and had graduated with honors that his professors spoke about for semesters afterward. The kind of student who does not appear in a classroom more than once or twice in a career. He had worked for a decade at a manufacturing company, developing precision systems for industrial equipment, and he had been, by any reasonable measure, exceptional at it. He had filed 4 patents. He had led a team of 22 engineers. He had presented at 2 international conferences and had twice been offered positions at organizations whose names appeared regularly in publications that tracked excellence in his field. He had declined them both, on both occasions because Denise had just found a rhythm that worked, because Maya had just started at a school she loved, because they had just discovered a Sunday morning routine involving pancakes and bad television that none of them were willing to give up for a relocation package and a more impressive business card. He had been, on the trajectory he was on, pointed toward a kind of professional success that most people in his field worked their entire careers to approximate. And then his wife, Denise, had been diagnosed, and the world had reorganized itself according to different priorities, and Marcus had reorganized with it. He had taken a leave of absence that had become a permanent departure. He had moved Maya closer to his mother's family. He had sold the house they had bought together and used part of the money to acquire the garage, which needed work, and he had worked on it, and in the working, he had found a version of himself that was quieter and more essential than the person he had been in conference rooms and research presentations. After Denise died, he had stayed. He had stayed because the garage was something he could hold, literally, in his hands, and because the work was honest in a way that felt necessary to him, and because Maya needed stability more than she needed a father with an impressive title, and because he had, in the way of people who have moved through profound loss, stopped being particularly interested in the version of success that required him to be somewhere other than where he was. There had been a period, in the first year without Denise, when colleagues had reached out carefully, with the diplomatic precision of people who want to offer an opening without applying pressure, to suggest that whenever he was ready, there would be a place for him. He had thanked each of them warmly and said nothing more specific than that he appreciated it. The reaching out had eventually stopped, as it does, because the world has its own momentum and cannot wait indefinitely for one person to reconnect with it. Marcus had not felt abandoned by this. He had felt released. He had no bitterness about the career he had set aside. It had been a fair trade, made with clear eyes and a full understanding of what was being exchanged. He simply did not talk about it, because the people around him had already decided what he was, and correcting their assumptions had never seemed worth the energy. Evelyn Carter learned all of this over the course of 2 conversations. The first was in the office behind the garage, where Marcus asked a direct question, gave a direct answer, without drama or embellishment. Yes, he had been an engineer. Yes, he had left. No, he did not regret it. The second conversation happened a week later, at a restaurant that was Evelyn's suggestion and Marcus's reluctant concession. He arrived on time, in the cleanest clothes he owned, and she arrived 3 minutes early, which was her standard. They sat across from each other and talked for 2.5 hours, and what Marcus understood by the end of it was that Evelyn Carter was not a woman who made gestures. She made decisions. The decision she had made, in the weeks since Route 16, was that she wanted Marcus involved in something she had been building for 2 years, a vocational training center attached to one of her company's regional facilities designed to give young people from low-income backgrounds access to certified technical education in mechanical, electrical, and engineering systems. She had the funding, she had the facility, she had, she told him, every resource the program needed, except one, a person she trusted to lead it. She had been looking for that person for 8 months. She had interviewed people with long resumes and strong references and the right kind of institutional credibility, and she had not found what she was looking for. And what she was looking for, she now understood, was not a credential. It was a character. It was the specific quality of a person who helps. Because helping is the right thing to do, and who does excellent work, because excellence is what the work deserves, and who does not calculate the return on an investment before deciding whether to make it. She had seen that person on a stretch of state route in the rain on a Thursday afternoon, and she had driven a convoy of vehicles across town to find him. And now she was asking. Marcus said no. He said it without hesitation, with the same uncomplicated clarity with which he had declined the money on the roadside. "I don't want charity," he said. His voice was level, not unkind, simply exact. Evelyn did not look surprised. She had expected this. She leaned forward slightly, the posture of someone making a point they have thought about carefully, and she said, "Neither do I. I want integrity." She let that sit for a moment before continuing. She told him she was not offering him a gift. She was offering him a position with real responsibilities, real accountability, and real compensation. She was offering it because she had evaluated her options, and he was the correct choice, and she made decisions based on evidence, not sentiment. She needed a director who had the technical expertise to build a serious curriculum, the credibility to earn the trust of young people who had been failed by institutions before, and the character to model what she wanted those young people to understand about how to move through the world. She was not offering him something he hadn't earned. She was recognizing what he had already been. Marcus listened. He was quiet for a long time after she finished. Outside, the restaurant moved around them in its ordinary way. "The garage stays open," he finally said. It was not a question. Evelyn said, "Of course." He said, "I set my own hours for the first 6 months, until I understand what the program actually needs." She said, "Agreed." He said, "I'm not wearing a suit to work." She almost smiled again more than the first time. This time, "I don't care what you wear to work," she said. "I care what you do there." Marcus looked at his hands. They were cleaner than usual, because he had scrubbed them thoroughly before leaving the garage, but the evidence of years was in them still, the particular topography of calluses and old small scars, and the permanent slight discoloration at the knuckles that no amount of cleaning entirely removes. He looked at his hands for a moment, and then he looked at Evelyn Carter and said, "All right." They shook hands across the table. The deal was made the way Marcus made everything, directly, without theater, and with the full weight of his word behind it. The story, when it became public, and it became public quickly, because the kind of story that involves a billionaire finding an ordinary man and offering him a consequential position does not stay private, in the age of constant documentation, had the quality of something that had been designed to produce a specific emotional response, except that it hadn't been designed at all, which is why the response it produced was so unmanageable. People who had dismissed Marcus now encountered the full version of events. The tire, the refusals, the shop rag in Evelyn Carter's coat pocket, the convoy arriving at a small garage on a Friday morning, the quiet conversation in the office with the vending machine, and the photograph of a 9-year-old girl at the beach. They encountered the engineering degree and the patents and the career set aside for a dying wife and a growing daughter and a garage that had never cheated anyone. The narrative moved through people in a way that narratives built on genuine things tend to move, not with the fast, frictionless momentum of something easy, but with the slower, heavier movement of something true. The men at the cafe on Elm Street were quiet in a way that went beyond their earlier silence. The person who had posted the dashcam clip with the condescending caption deleted the post and said nothing, which was perhaps the most honest response available to them. Customers who had haggled with Marcus over the years showed up at the garage with slightly more consideration in their bearing, though Marcus treated them exactly as he had always treated them, which was to say, with the same calm and uncomplicated decency he extended to everyone. He did not gloat. He did not say anything to anyone that could be interpreted as vindication. He did not bring up the clip, or the commentary, or the laughter in the cafe. He was not performing magnanimity. He simply did not experience the moment as a triumph over anything, because he had never experienced the dismissal as a defeat. His life had not changed because other people's opinions of him had changed. His life had changed because he had made a decision based on the correct reasons, which was to say, he had agreed to do work he believed in with a person he had found, in a single practical encounter, to be honest and clear-eyed, and genuinely interested in building something worthwhile. The opinions of the town were not a variable in that equation. They never had been. What they thought of him, when they were laughing, was no more relevant than what they thought of him now that they had stopped. He was the same man. He had always been the same man. He just had a new job. The Vocational Training Center opened in the spring, on a Tuesday, with a ceremony that Marcus attended in his standard work clothes because Evelyn had told him he could, and because he saw no reason to pretend to be someone else for the benefit of an occasion. He had allowed Noah Evelyn's 12-year-old, who had insisted on coming and who had spent the drive to the ceremony asking Marcus questions about engines with an intensity that Marcus recognized as the specific hunger of a child who has found a subject that genuinely interests them, to sit beside him on the small stage, which had not been planned, but which nobody objected to, because the image of the two of them sitting there together, the boy leaning in with his elbows on his knees and Marcus answering him in the patient, unhurried way of a man who has explained things to young people his whole life, was more honest than any prepared statement. Marcus spoke briefly at the opening, not about himself, and not about Route 16, and not about any of the things the journalists in attendance were hoping he might address. He spoke about the young people who would come through the program. He spoke about what it meant to learn a skill properly, to develop the kind of competence that belongs to you completely, that no one can revoke and no circumstance can easily take away. He spoke about work, about the honest, irreplaceable dignity of doing something well with your hands and your knowledge and your full attention. He did not speak about any of this as a lesson. He spoke about it as a fact, the way a person speaks about something they have lived long enough to understand without needing it explained to them. He told the young people in the room, there were 31 of them, the first cohort, ranging in age from 17 to 24, most of them carrying the particular brand of careful skepticism that comes from institutions that have promised things and not delivered them, that the program would ask something real of them, and that it would give something real in return, and that the exchange was fair, and that fair exchanges were worth more than most people gave them credit for because they were rarer than they should be. He did not tell them about his own story. He did not think his own story was the point. When he finished, he stepped away from the microphone without waiting for the applause to resolve, the way a man steps away from a job once he's done it correctly. Evelyn watched him from across the room with an expression that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same territory. She had gotten what she came for. She always did. Jackson's auto stayed open. Marcus had insisted on this, and Evelyn had agreed, and it had not been a sentimental gesture on either of their parts. The garage was Marcus's ground, the place where his work and his identity had their most literal expression, and removing it from his life to make room for the new thing would have been like editing the beginning of a sentence to make the ending look more polished. The work that happened in that garage was as real and as necessary as any work done in a glass-walled conference room, and Marcus had never needed anyone to tell him that, but he appreciated that Evelyn understood it without being told. The old pickup truck still occupied its spot on the side of the building, reliable and unhurried and marked by a decade of use. The photograph of Maya still hung on the office wall, though a newer one had joined it, Maya at 14, in her school's annual recital, slightly blurry because Marcus had been trying too hard to get the framing right and had forgotten about focus. She had called him when she heard about the program, the conversation running longer than their usual Wednesday calls, her voice moving through pride and excitement, and the slightly performative worry of a teenager who had been taught to take their parents' well-being seriously and now had a context in which to apply that lesson. "Are you okay, Dad?" she had asked, at the end of a long account of everything she had read and heard. "Same as always," Marcus had said. "That's not an answer," she had said. He had thought about it for a moment. "Better," he had said. "A little better." He could hear her smile through the phone. That was enough. That had always been enough. A journalist from a regional paper came to the garage 6 weeks after the opening of the training center, asking for a quote, and Marcus had agreed to speak briefly, because Evelyn had suggested it might be useful for the program's public profile, and Marcus did things that were useful when the usefulness was real. He had offered the journalist coffee from the vending machine, exact change required, he noted, without apology, and she had laughed, and they had stood together in the bay while Marcus worked, and the conversation had moved in the way conversations move when one person is comfortable and the other person is gradually understanding that they should be too. The journalist asked a series of questions, most of which Marcus answered in the compact and unembellished way of a man who does not have a media relationship with his own story. The final question was the one she had been building toward the entire conversation, the one she had probably scripted on the drive over. "What's the biggest thing that changed in your life?" she asked, "because of all of this?" Marcus looked at her for a moment, then looked briefly at the garage door, which was open because it was a warm morning, and he preferred the air. He was quiet long enough that the journalist wondered if she had miscalculated. Then he said, "Nothing changed. I still stop for people with flat tires." He picked up his wrench and went back to the engine he had been looking at when she arrived, and the journalist wrote down what he had said word for word, because there was nothing she could add to it that would improve it. 3 weeks later, on a warm Friday morning in May, Marcus was driving the old pickup along Route 16. Not the same stretch, but the same road when he came around a bend and saw a car sitting at an awkward angle on the shoulder. A young man, maybe 20, was standing beside it, looking at the rear wheel with the expression of someone who has encountered a problem they were not equipped for and is not yet sure how to feel about that. He had a backpack on, which suggested he was going somewhere, and a look on his face that suggested he was not sure he was going to get there. No one else had stopped. 3 cars passed, while Marcus was still pulling over. He got out of the truck without checking the time, without thinking about the first appointment at the training center that he was now going to be slightly late for, without any of the calculations that most people would have conducted automatically. He walked to the young man with his hands easy at his sides, in the same unhurried way he had walked toward a woman in a charcoal coat on a wet October afternoon, which felt both very long ago and exactly as present as this moment. The young man looked at him with the wariness of someone who has not yet learned how to read good intentions at a distance. Marcus tilted his head toward the tire. "Let's take a look," he said. The young man said nothing, but he stepped back, and Marcus knelt down beside the wheel, and the morning went on around them, ordinary and unhurried, and entirely unaware that anything of any significance was taking place, which was, in the end, exactly as Marcus preferred it. kindness is never wasted. Sometimes, it simply takes one more day or one more rainy afternoon on an empty road to come back.